welcome back. I am Felipe Barrera. I'm going to be chairing this session. Thank you for the organizers for this invitation. It's so nice to be here. Intellectually, it's very stimulating, this conference, and I am so happy to see people face to face. So this session is about alternative modalities of provision. Implicit in the title, the idea of a system is there. Yesterday, Luis Krauss says economists have been neglecting the study of the market. Likewise, yesterday, Lamprecht talked about the failure of the idea of the market as a mechanism to correct some of the problems of low quality of education. So still, I believe that it is important to see the system as a system, and that includes to investigate the market and its structure, to investigate competition, to investigate segregation and sorting. Segregation is the other side of the coin of low-quality education. So this topic is critical and fascinating. Once you start thinking about social organization, it's difficult to think of other social problems. So we have 4 papers here. One of, as Claire says, one of the presenters of the initial program couldn't attend, but luckily for us, Abhijeet stepped in and he will present his important work in India. And while I was reading the papers, 2 common themes came to my mind. First of all, 2 papers stress the idea to look into the actual experience of the units under different interventions. So Rind will talk about the experience of providers in a public-private partnership program in Pakistan, and Prachi will talk about the experience of students under the Right to Education Act in India. The contrast between these 2 papers and the experiences and the positive effects coming from impact evaluations are very puzzling. So I hope that we will have a healthy discussion about this apparent contradiction. The second topic that I see linking 2 papers in this section is 2 papers stress the idea that the importance of the allocation mechanism into schools. A very important theoretical model by McLeod and Urquiola showed that if private schools can choose students under a voucher system, they will choose students with better preparation and higher income, leading to sorting and segregation of the system. I think that the paper of Abhijeet talks to that issue, to that important issue, and Shrikant will discuss how centralized systems can help solving that problem as well. So, given these 2 topics, I propose the following order of presentations. First, we have Prachi. Prachi is online. Then Gul, then Srikant, and then Abhijeet. Without further ado, Prachi, the floor is yours. You will have 15 minutes. When there are 5 minutes remaining, I will let you know. So let's start. Prachi.
Hi, everybody. I'm very sorry not to be there in person, but I'm very happy to be able to present this paper. The paper is on a micro-study that we did for students attending private schools under the Right to Education Act, but it's part of a much larger program of work and a set of integrated studies of schooling patterns and differentiated access under the Right to Education Act. I think most of you in the room would already be aware. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but the Right to Education Act was effective as of August 2010. It's a universalizing legal framework for all schools in India to provide elementary education of a reasonable quality for all children between the ages of 6 to 14 years old. It's a significant legal instrument, actually, because before this, while there were many different, while the states had different legislations, there was not one universalizing framework. But it implicates private schools in very specific ways. And in particular, Section 12(1)(c) has what we call colloquially the free seats provision, in which all students, in which all private schools, private unaided schools, that is independent fee-paying schools, must provide 25% of their schools of their seats for free to children that are under specific classifications of social and economic disadvantage. But there are other parts of the Act that are also important, and they focus on more qualitative aspects of inclusion in an ideal sense. Things such as no corporal punishment, no child shall be held back or expelled, child-centered pedagogy, and environments free of fear and trauma and anxiety. So these are some of the key provisions that you'll see up on the screen. We focused primarily in this program of work on a host of issues around inclusion, and of course had a specific focus on the free seats provision, and particularly disadvantaged students and students from Dalit backgrounds. The more conceptual framing around this particular piece of work or this paper was around the idea of thinking about silent exclusion and education exclusion as much more a broader part of social exclusion. And for me, it was very important to think about education exclusion as really coming about from what we would think of broader patterns around multiple collectivities and social identifiers of individual groups that are inserted in various ways into the institutional structure of education. What do we really mean by that? I mean more about thinking of how a universalizing framework like the Right to Education Act would affect different students and different groups of households accessing education from at an individual level, but also in terms of the implementation of the Act, both in terms of different states, but also private schools in particular, if we're thinking about this paper, how they actually implemented the Act and what the experiential nature of that was. I am very partial to the idea that there are different collectivities that privilege certain individuals, and that those collectivities kind of change across time and space. So for example, in the Indian context, if you are a rural Dalit girl, or if you are a Muslim student in a low income area, in an urban area, you're more likely to experience something called hardcore exclusion, which is the product of destructive synergies. Whereas if you are a male, urban, high caste, Hindi speaking student in the mid and north parts of India, you're likely to experience synergistic empowerment. And what that really means is that even if there is a universalizing framework around that has ideas around inclusion, the experience of that is going to be very different. So then really, how do we understand the differential effects? For this particular paper, we were very interested in exploring the idea around silent exclusion. And silent exclusion for the paper is thought about students who may be nominally enrolled and are attending, but they're inserted into the schooling environment in ways that reinforce or create disadvantage and inhibit meaningful access. And this includes normative patterns of interaction and the way that formal institutional structures and processes are actually applied to those students. Really, what we're trying to understand is to move from counting children in school to accounting for their experiences, and really trying to understand this concept of meaningful access to make sure that students are supported in a systematic way to kind of not just basic skills and knowledge, but also in normative ways that respect their dignity and their background. So it's really trying to think beyond some of the more procedural ways. And here, there's a host of literature that looks at the socioeconomic variables that are associated with variable access on learning and on learning outcomes across public and private schools in India, and also more qualitative studies that look at differential axes. So I want to begin also by kind of highlighting that it's known that even though there is this inclusive framework, that it's much more an idealized notion. And the quote you see here in the gray panel comes from personal communication with a senior government official who was very closely involved in drafting the act and also implementing it. And really trying to understand this idea of thinking of schools as a common place where all children sit, eat, and live together for at least 8 years. And I think the idea around the life of the school and the way that it's actually experienced comes out quite strongly in this idealized notion around the 25% free seats provision. So as I mentioned, this paper is part of a much larger study. The study involved two major areas of analyses. There was regulatory analysis of all states and union territories in which we documented and looked at the regulatory provisions with respect to Section 12(1)(c). And we also conducted a range of expert analytic interviews to try and understand what the normative principles were underlying the Act and the free seats provision. But the larger amount of work was really looking at household level analysis. And there were 3 integrated studies that were done for this. The first was a survey of 851 households in one catchment area in Delhi. And the catchment area included schools of all government and private school types. And in India, government schools are all the way from the central government to the municipal government, and they have varied assessed levels of quality and also different ways of access. And we wanted to ask specifically in low middle income neighborhoods, what were the schooling experience, what were the access patterns, who accessed perceived better quality schools in both the government and private sectors, and what were the experiences of households. From this survey, we actually selected a very small number of children to do a much more participatory research around their lived experiences of schooling. And this is what I'm going to be presenting. This was a small number of children, 16 children, 8 who had free ships and 8 who didn't. And they all attended private unaided schools, and they were coming from marginalized backgrounds. The majority of them were Dalit children. And then the final set of work that we did was we went back to 50 Dalit households that were recruited in the first survey to conduct more in-depth, semi-structured interviews with them to understand what their experience was 2 years after having had the free ship access for at least one of their children. And the survey and the interview data are actually being analyzed, and we hope to be publishing the results of those soon. So these were just some indicators that we included in the survey for households that were more experiential, trying to understand what some of the patterns might have been, how some of their daily life might have been. We can talk about this more in the Q&A. I just wanted to give you a view. And then these are some of the interviews that we had with Dalit free ship households. And we wanted to ask them to tell us more about the schools. How did they feel? Did they feel that their children were being treated differentially? What kind of actions were taken by the school to help the children in terms of inclusion? And then, of course, we asked around their experiences of actually accessing free ships. Was it easy to access free ships? Was there a lot of social networking? We assumed there would be gaming in the system, and we wanted to know if that actually worked out. So again, if you want to ask questions about what the parents and households experienced, you can in the Q&A, but I just wanted to give a little bit of background there. So what did we do with the children? We did 3 participatory draw and talk child interviews, plus a series of vignettes over almost 10 months of time, or actually 3 months of time and additional months for analysis. We asked them questions around their favorite teachers. We asked them questions around happy moments at school, classroom environments. And we asked them a lot about their friends and what kind of activities they had. Can you tell us about treatment? And we wanted to gauge a little bit about how they were really feeling about being there and understanding more about their life experiences inside and outside of school. This is one picture that was drawn around the classroom environment. And Sai taught this one boy, these are all pseudonyms. Sai talked about teacher absence and how in this private school, there was a lot of teacher absence and students would act out. And there was some kind of level of, havoc, I want to say, within the class. And also talked about power relationships in terms of what would happen when teachers were not in class. So what we found, which is unsurprising, but it was really, really powerful to hear it from the students, was schooling occupies one portion. It's a significant portion, but it's just one part of the experience of their lives as children, and it's a multi-relational experience, and the environment of the home is really, really important to understand where that fits in and how they make sense of their daily existence and the place of the school. You can read the experience of Naveen, who was a 10-year-old free ship student. His family came from the general caste, which would place him caste-wise in a relatively advantaged position. But his family was severely economically disadvantaged and sustained multiple hardships. So again, it's trying to understand positioning in terms of these different identifiers and how different identifiers lay the experience for children. His family lived in a shared multifamily unit. And when Lafleur went in to do the first set of participatory activities, his mother was resting on a mattress on the floor. At the foot of the mattress, there was a 2-burner stove and a pile of dishes. And it was a very small room. And they did the research activity outside in the doorway. Very significantly, when Lafleur returned a few weeks later, he found Naveen's head was freshly shaven, and that's a very symbolic. It's a very striking symbol for people who are aware of mourning traditions, particularly amongst Hindu families in India. When a very close family member dies, usually the person who's done the cremation shaves their head. And so when Mike came back, he saw that Naveen had shaved his head and he'd lost his mother due to an illness. And he talked a lot about how, there was competing hardships and how these hardships obviously, affected his life. And so what is the position of the school within the context of children who are coming from deeply disadvantaged backgrounds, even if on paper, for example, from the survey, we wouldn't have really understood Naveen's relative disadvantage. What we would have thought was Naveen is he's a higher caste student, he's gotten a free ship, so he's attending a private school. So he's a lucky one. But actually, when you understand his experience, then you have to think about whether or not those experiences are accounted for within the context of schooling and what that means for access and continued access over time. Was there support for his family? How did that actually play out over time?
Prachi, time is up. You need to finish. Can
I have the last screen? It's just one screen. This is my last screen. Okay, thank you. The final kind of screen is there. The children's accounts were surprising to us in some ways because we expected to see gender or caste-based differences in terms of the way that they told us about their experience. But actually, we didn't see that. What we saw was relatively widespread labeling of children as either naughty or academically weak or incapable. And this was both by teachers and by peers. There was quite a lot of authority that was conferred to certain peers in leadership roles. And that authority was basically, again, a question around reproducing the kinds of disciplinary norms that were already established by teachers. There was a lot of talking around stigmatization, and discouraging likability of certain kinds of children, and in particular, children that had or were perceived to be slow. There was a lot of discussion around children that were not mentally fit or slow in picking up concepts, so children with special needs. And there didn't seem to be a lot of experienced gender or caste bias. And our only, what we could ascertain from this was that most of the students that were accessing the free ship schools, the private schools under free ships, were accessing private schools that were in relatively poorer neighborhoods and had relatively more homogeneous populations. So these were not students that were accessing private schools that had a very large disparity of economically and even caste-wise or social background-wise between free ship and non-free ship students. So that was a surprising finding, but that was kind of what we found in terms of the patterns of access. So I'm going to end there. Thank you very much for giving me the extra 2 minutes.
Thank you, Prachi. Now we will move right to Gul. Gul, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm just going to share my screen.
Perfect.
Okay. My name is Gul Rind. I recently graduated, just defended my PhD dissertation from Miami University, and I'm a lecturer at Sakkara University. Let me go back, yeah. So today I'm going to present on public-private partnership in education, evaluation of education management organizations program in Sindh province of Pakistan. So what is public-private partnership in education and why? I think most of you are familiar. Public-private partnership is an arrangement where government finance and private sector provide services to public. PPP, public-private partnership in education, is a global phenomena. It's not something new in Pakistan. There are a lot of factors which also cause public-private partnership. That's like a goal of education for all, later revised as a sustainable development goals. And especially countries like developing countries, Pakistan, they have a limited government capacity to reach out entire country or all part of the country. So definitely they feel the role of private sector should be elevated in order to facilitate governments. Another reason is donor funding and aid conditionalities. They like donors are more compatible with private sector than government, because in government sector, teacher union and other barriers cause a lot of issues. And there are like a policy convergence through international standards, which also favor public-private partnerships. So I need to go a bit quick because I have many slides. So public-private partnership concept in education, I think this diagram was given by Petrino and his colleagues through World Bank publication. In Pakistan, we have in Sindh province of Pakistan, we have two main PPP models. One is emerging model, another is engaged. So if you go from left to right, it's a low PPP to high PPP. In emerging model, we have subsidies to private schools, low-cost private schools through Sindh Education Foundation, and in engaged. Recently, we have like a private management of public school through education management organization. So these are two different kinds of PPP in Sindh province of Pakistan. One is very low-cost model, which is like a government pay subsidies of 1,000 rupees, around like it's I don't know, it's in dollar, it's now $400 or 500, whatever. But as compared to this education management organization, this is more expensive model where government pay like more than $3,000, 3,000 rupees in. And they have also good, nice buildings and other facilities. So why PPP in Sindh? There was several reasons, but main reason was low access to education and learning crisis. In Sindh province, still we have around 60% of access to education, primary and secondary level, but still their quality is also not in a good shape. As a result, shows a lot of issues. And poor governance of education in public sector, because there are inefficiencies and bureaucratic hurdles. And another issue is also attracting donors funding. So my research question was based on to what extent, how, and for whom does PPP mode of education through education management organizations improve accessibility to education in Sindh province of Pakistan, and how effectively and efficiently do PPP in education through EMO Sindh province of Pakistan meet the objective of quality education. And also a third one question was about equity, how much it addressed the gap between gender, income, and context, right, the rural-urban gap. Later said we have also added fourth question about the sustainabilities of PPP EMOs, because we have seen a lot of initiatives in Sindh or in Pakistan, they got discontinued. So that was also concerned. So there are different education management organizations working in Sindh. These are some of these names. Some are very they have good experience in education distribution or education services like the Sakrai VA, the Citizen Foundation, and there are also some new NGOs, but they have a very good work in social sector, but limited capacity in education. So in theoretically, we have applied new public management concept in PPP in education. We have seen new public management values apply rules of accountability, managerialism, and decentralization, which empower schools at local level to achieve these required targets. And there's a school-based management. There are certain criticism also on new public management, because they apply more outcome-based approach, like these schools are being measured based on their results in certain, like a SAT score. SAT is a school achievement test of these schools. And these accountability also cause reduction of their funding. So in methodology, we have selected realist evaluation method, which take in account of real world complexity. In policy evaluation, normally these interventions being evaluated through randomized control trial, but we thought randomized control trial might only tell what works in education, like whether these models succeed or fail, but it might not tell to whom it worked, under what condition. So realist evaluation apply more contextual things. And it also gave the idea that under what mechanism these outcomes has been generated. So realist evaluation is a theory-based evaluation. So we have developed theory of change. Theory of change of education management organization, there's a input, then mechanism, then expected outcome. So our input was that education governance through decentralization and private management of public school through mechanism of competitive funding, school autonomy, pedagogical diversification and innovation, accountability, and management tools will yield results of like increased enrollment, ensure equity, quality education. It also creates some innovation. So the evaluation system of these outcomes are based on, there's a bidding and entrance rule and key performance indicators given to these EMOs. We have collected data from all stakeholders of education management organizations. We have reviewed documents and legal contracts, interviewed with key informants, which include policy developer from Sindh Education Literacy Department, Government of Sindh, interview with the donors, USAID and Asian Development Bank, because they are also supporting in education management organization, and some independent experts. We have also interviewed with EMO operators who are operating schools, semi-structured interview with EMO schools, which include EMO managers and school head teachers, and focus group interview with teachers and parents. We have also analyzed secondary data of SAT score and PSLM survey data of Pakistan. It's a Pakistan Social Living Standard Measurement Survey. So we have analyzed data based on realist evaluation approach, through which we applied context, mechanism, and outcome configuration. So qualitative data has been transcribed and coded and presented based on themes. Quantitative data has been analyzed descriptively. In the end, we have merged and triangulated these themes. Based on our data analysis, two broader themes or section emerged. Number one was evaluation of education reform policy through EMOs of PPP models. And number second, the outcome of these EMOs in terms of quality education, equity, and its sustainability. So I'm going to discuss some findings. So education, EMO and PPP is a very, it's not easy, and somehow it's also complex because a lot of donors involved and policies being developed at government level. So its interpretation and translation at local level is also different, what we have seen. For example, at the government of Sindh level, they feel PPP is something like a technical arrangement where government provide funds to private sector and private sector support government. However, when we ask similar questions from donors, like they feel PPPs should be viewed broadly. It's not like something, if someone donate computer or someone donate something, then it's a PPP. It should be like a more voucher kind of PPP. It should be like a more, they should apply school-based management tools and these kind of things. Even PPP at local level, teachers or parents, even school manager, they view it differently. So PPP has a better perception of service from, they feel PPP provides service from prominent private sectors. One thing was interesting, within donors, they have a different priorities in PPP, what we found, because mainly World Bank, DFID, ADB, and USAID. World Bank and DFID, they promote more like
cool. 5 minutes.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I need to go quickly. So they promote more kind of low-cost private school model. However, USAID and ADB recently concentrated more on contract schools, like a private management of public schools, like a government schools being handed over to private sector. So there are several challenges in EMO model. It's somehow more contextualized than other PPP model, like a foundation schools, because in EMO contracts are very clear, and their process of selection of these private partner is very transparent and fair. But there are certain local issues of ownership, because government teachers, they don't own these schools. They feel these schools are being run by private sector. Within EMO, some EMOs are performing very well we have seen, because they have a good experience in education, like a Sukkur IBA, the Citizen Foundation, but those who are recently, they worked in education, previously they worked in other social sector, they were struggling in providing quality education. I need to move quickly. So governance through decentralization, autonomy, competition, and accountability because PPP model was based on these values. We have seen it work very well in accountability and autonomy because schools were decentralized, and their monitoring and evaluation was strong, and it reduced ghost teachers, because in Sindh we have a lot of teachers, government teachers, but they were in paper, but they were not coming in school. But one thing is that in EMO monitoring evaluation, they don't have more educators, but they have something, those who have some MBA degrees, or which they really don't understand the complexities of learning outcomes and other things. So competition, differentiation, and innovation, I already mentioned some schools have a good innovation and competitive advantage because they already work well, and they have also, they got a school on high bidding price. And those who got at lowest bidding price, they were really struggling. And teachers hiring mechanism was quick, but their remuneration is very minimum, because the teachers of these schools getting salaries like even half of the public school teachers. So that was something concern. In terms of financing and efficiency, these schools are very high cost school as compared to foundation schools, which is being subsidized. So I will later discuss whether that model will be sustainable or not. But in terms of community participation, they really engage parents, but their engagement is not legally bounded. So that contract is between partner and government. Outcome of these PPP, they focus more on post-primary schools, which was needed because in Sindh we have a more primary schools. Yeah, I need to go first because I got warning of 2 minutes. In terms of enhancing student enrollment, we can say these all organizations made their target, but overall they didn't reflect in province of Sindh. You can say still Sindh province have a large number of out of school children, especially in rural areas, because these schools focus on rural areas. These before EMOs and after EMO, we have evaluated these data. You can quickly scan that they didn't improve largely those districts where this EMO intervention has been initiated. In terms of quality education, which is they give better perception of quality because compared to public school, parents have more confidence. But if we measure through SET result, which is conducted by Sindh province, before EMO and after EMO, they didn't get better. There's no difference. So we can say there's a mixed outcomes in terms of educational outcomes. And there is also concern of sustainability because these schools are just for given to private sector for 10 years contract. After contracts, there's a concern these schools will be again given to back to government. So government still didn't enhance their efficiency to run these schools. So the recommendation, it's a final word. So my recommendations is that different PPP models should be under one umbrella system because it creates more inequality because foundation schools are very low paid school. And these PPP should be more targeted where there's a shortage of teachers, where a lot of students are not going to school because of their poverty and other reasons. And their accountability and regulation should also be based on, not based on outcome, but also providing like input to, like, let's suppose some school really struggling for quality teacher, they should be incentivized. And that finally, there should be a robust data for evidence-informed decision because still data is administrative, which somehow also confusing. Thank you very much.
Google.
I think I got
now, we are going to hear from Srikant. Srikant. This is so stressful, guys. Yeah.
Yes. Nothing can be better than the chair saying it's stressful at the start of your session. So, good morning. My name is Shrikant. I'm a final year PhD student at the University of Edinburgh. And my doctoral studies in Edinburgh are funded by Edinburgh Global Research Scholarship and the College Research Award. I'm not boasting about my profile to gain your attention, but these things came up in a few conversations I was having with some of my friends recently when they were complaining about university education being so expensive. And when I revealed that I have scholarships, they felt, oh, you are so lucky to get these scholarships. And I said, I would consider myself lucky only if I could afford at least a week-long stay in Edinburgh, let alone the 3-year doctoral program. And that's when they became highly sympathetic, adulatory of the university scholarship scheme. And they found it very efficient that it was able to target the right kind of candidate. And it struck me how obviously we get concerned about efficiency and targeting when we are thinking about any welfare policy, let alone the merit-based scholarships in my case. So my friends asserted their principal concern for efficiency, accuracy, and targeting. And the engineers and bureaucrats I interviewed a while ago echoed the same concerns. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, how the bureaucracy, technology, and their concern for efficiency can affect the policy in terms of social justice, equity, and inclusion. So within the mercy of 15 minutes, next slide, how do I go to next slide? Does someone move the next slide? Oh, okay. Okay. So within the mercy of 15 minutes, we will try answering these questions. Prachi has done a wonderful, Prachi has done a wonderful job of taking out some policy introduction already. So we have slightly better time now. So let us look at the social reality where the policy for inclusion of marginalized children into private schools is located. The Indian school system is segregated and hierarchized. So we have compartments of elite private schools, special category government schools on the one hand, and the local state-run schools, low-budget private schools, tribal schools on the other hand. And this is accompanied by schools that are run by religious institutions and other civil society organizations. We also have a strong and growing industry of for-profit companies that are running private tuition tuitions and coaching at school and college level. For the paucity of time and also for the online attenders, I have included the references in full. I wish I could discuss them in detail, but it's 12 minutes remaining. So I'll go to the next slide. Um, the title of my presentation, as you might have seen, is a slightly misleading title, but good enough that it pulled all of you into this room. Online portals on their own cannot include marginalized students into private schools. Such an education reform needs a strong policy buttressing them. And it is the policy that Prachi introduced already that we are talking about, where private schools in India have a mandate to keep aside at least 25% seats for weaker and disadvantaged group children. And the criteria for this 25% seats is determined by states, for local state governments. And it might include applicants' caste, class, family background, even physical disabilities, whether they are orphan or if they are coming from HIV families, etc. So it's a very broad criteria that we are looking at. There are three entities in this system. There are private schools, which have had no social obligation or accountability in the contemporary political economy of school education. Indeed, if they are, they're indeed selective and at times exclusionary as well. And the Act is asking these private schools to assimilate fee-paying students from privileged groups with their peers from historically disempowered groups. Secondly, we are targeting underprivileged students. We learned about them a lot from Prachi's presentation already. Thirdly, there is a state machinery, which comprises bureaucrats, computer engineers, designing the enrollment system. And they often have a pragmatic view of this reform, the one that focuses on efficiency and accuracy. And when the states tried implementing this act for the first time, they found that the private schools typically avoided compliance with the affirmative action. For those who did comply with it, they often had preference for certain kinds of students fitting their definition. And as a result, the state assumed the Herculean task of managing the entire enrollment process. And in a 21st century developing country like India, if the state wants to take in its hand such a process, then it implies two things: centralization and digitization. So our focus here is on digitization. And just to point out, even with just a 25% quota, this digitization is potentially encompassing more than 10 million seats in 93,000 private schools every year. So yet this is a very tiny number against the potential number of children who apply for these seats, which can be as high as 20 times the number of seats. Before we turn to findings, here is a brief visit to our research design and methods. Our study is informed by the understanding of social justice that requires the reorientation of policy, procedures, and rules towards equitable distribution. I won't go into details of these methods, but I'm just showing them so that you know I didn't make this up. So we are considering 4 states: Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Karnataka, and Rajasthan. The findings are drawn from literature, our own portal testing, and structured interviews of stakeholders. And these are our main concerns behind the study, which also reflect in the way I would present my findings. So let us look at the key findings that we have here. The agency for a match between the school and a child rests conspicuously with the applicants. So every applicant fills up a form indicating their preference for a school, and then the system tries matching them with one of their preferences. The matching mechanism is a computerized algorithm. It's a random lottery, and we discuss it in 2 parts: how they recognize data of applicants and how they process that data. So for the paucity of time, we are not discussing how they register school data. We move directly to the applicants. In all the 4 states, if you are a child seeking admission in private school and you are eligible for the quota, then you must be registered in the digital records of the state. So it is a job of your parents or guardians to register your profile online. This includes your name, sex, age, residential address, and your eligibility as a person from disadvantaged backgrounds. And in India, since the colonial times, each of these details is valid only if you have a government-approved certificate for it. There are set offline and online procedures in urban and rural areas to obtain these certificates. They involve typical street-level bureaucracy issues apart from logistical delays and costs. And for our study, it is interesting how the people behind the online portals, the programmers, turn into street-level bureaucrats themselves. In Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh, they ask you to upload the certificates. In Karnataka, they are a bit forgiving. They just ask you to mention the certificate number. And in Rajasthan, they care about your certificate only when you approach a school for admission. It is expensive for applicants to obtain the certificates, let alone create soft copies and upload them to the portal, and then register themselves as valid applicants. We have found this first step as de facto exclusionary process for registration of applicants itself. Moreover, the convenient process that we talked about in Karnataka, where they only register certificate numbers, is going through an opaque internal verification step later where they check your certificate number with the government records. And if there is a mismatch, then your application is purged out of the system. And we found out that the algorithm filtered out more than 100,000 applicants at the very first step here. So notably, Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan have an option of offline application, but in Madhya Pradesh, it's a straightforward option, so you fill the same form that you would find online. In Rajasthan, however, the system can collect your application from multiple points, so you can go to every private school of your preference, see it if it appeals to you, and then fill up the form for that. While this is a wonderful facility, you get to see the school, but it also increases logistical costs, both for the applicants as well as the schools. And I missed one row kind of deliberately in this table for the requirement of applicant address. The allotment typically favors applicants from school's neighborhood. So except Maharashtra, you upload your address with your PIN code and the administrative block within which you reside. And the school is considered in your neighborhood if the administrative block of the school matches with yours. But in Maharashtra, because our engineers want accurate information, you must upload your address with a GPS location on a Google map. So if you're closer to a school, your chances of getting admission are much higher. And this obsession with accuracy presumes that all applicants have digital as well as spatial literacy. Typically, when you do not have such knowledge in India, you seek help from private agents who can do the application for a fee. And we found some very creative and interesting ways here. Some applicants place themselves on a mountaintop, even in the Arabian Sea, just to get within the radius of their desired schools so that they get admission. Their tricks did not always work for the address verification stage during the admission, but it showed us how an overcomplicated rule can also be circumvented with an overcomplicated deception. Anyways, we now have the successfully registered applicants. Each applicant has 5 minutes. Has indicated their preferred schools. In Madhya Pradesh and Karnataka, the preferences are in order. In Maharashtra and Rajasthan, there is no order for preferences. So once we have the preferences, the system has to make allotments. As I said earlier, your neighborhood area matters in determining your match with the school. All states except Karnataka prioritize allotments based on not only your neighborhood, but also a combination of disadvantages. So if I'm in the neighborhood, I'm also an orphan, I'm also a Dalit, I'm also a woman, then my chances are way higher than other students eligible from the same neighborhood. After considering these criteria, the algorithm used random number series to match the applicants with schools. I cannot go into the depth of randomization technique right now, but it is useful to note one aspect here. Except Maharashtra, all the three algorithms start randomization right away and go from one applicant to the other. Only in Maharashtra, we see randomization happening school-wise. And this is a sensible decision. It's interesting how the other three states did not think of it. In Maharashtra, if a school has fewer applicants than the seats, then the algorithm confirms allotments for all the applicants to that school. This obvious step does not happen in other three states. So let us look at the kind of outcomes you get in the 4 states at the end of the lottery. I would like you to think of these 4 columns and rank them in your mind as worst to best, and I will share my understanding as well. So the worst algorithm, only for algorithm, not for the previous slide. The worst algorithm outcome is in Karnataka. You receive a single school allotment. The state picks the ideal applicants and closes the process for them. It also discards the fact that parents may have preferences in certain order within which the system has failed to record them already. And during our study, we also learned from the senior government officials that they were planning to allot schools even if a child has not applied for one, just to complete the vacancies. The second worst in our analysis is Madhya Pradesh system. It accounts for the order of school preferences. However, it closes the application with a single allotment. So if a child does not confirm their admission, there is no scope for other applicants to try the same school. Do I have a chance if someone from my preferred school cancels the admission? No, in the Madhya Pradesh algorithm, that's not possible. The third worst or the second best is Rajasthan. You do not receive a confirmed allotment, but you receive priority numbers for all the schools that you have listed. Let us say I'm in London, I listed Westminster and St. Paul as my preferences. I got my lottery result as Westminster #1 and St. Paul as #3 as the priority numbers. It means I have a confirmed admission in Westminster, but in St. Paul school, I can only go if the priority numbers 1 and 2 do not show up for admission. That gives a lot of flexibility, but leaves a lot of negotiation room for parents at the school level. And lastly, the best outcome is in Maharashtra, definitely not for their Google Map fetish, but this is the best outcome. You receive a list of schools where you have a guarantee of admission if your documents are okay. And Maharashtra does not record the order of preferences as we saw initially, but it gives you flexibility at the right time. There is no point picking one school over another when you don't have equal chances of getting through the admission. So Maharashtra recognizes that, and it also has multiple rounds to account for school seats that remain vacant after the first round. So I invite you to think about the questions on the left side of this slide, and additionally think about the ranking that I have shared. Probably we can discuss this over tea later. We note 3 institutional features that are outside the ambit of algorithms per se, but have significant impact on their design. Firstly, in Rajasthan, the state with poor outcomes but decently accessible online portal, the software engineers sit within the education department. So this proximity gives them an edge as they know the practices of school admission, typical issues in the education department, and so on. Secondly, in Maharashtra and Rajasthan, we noted there is active presence of democratically elected leaders in the enrollment process. They had set up their own help centers for applicants. This is indeed a welcome move, as the leaders can get first-hand information on the issues and also communicate it fast to the executive government. Lastly, we know that the role of civil society organization is crucial in the implementation of this policy. We found absolutely no evidence downplaying the enhanced role of civil society organizations in the grievance redressal system. If you are familiar with Indian education context, then it's a long shot to get your grievances redressed, but the civil society organizations make it possible. The last sentence. So irrespective of the flaws that we have seen in the 4 systems, it cannot be gainsaid that this is an improved state for the assimilation of privileged students with their underprivileged peers. Thank you so much.
And now, Abhijeet.
Wrong slides. Yes, that one. This is the. This presentation wasn't slotted, but follows my general principle of never turning down an invitation to talk. But you'll see that this actually goes really well with the presentations that Prachi and Shrikant just did. And this is also going to be about the RTE quotas in private schools. It's work that's joined with Mauricio Romero, who's at ITAM and one of the PIs along with me in the India country research team. And private schooling is really important in lots of settings. It's very important in settings like India. And we're trying to look at lots of different things around it. But the specific thing that I want to be talking to you about is exactly the same policy that Prachi and Shrikant were just talking about. Right? And where is this coming from? This is coming from the idea that a third of rural enrollment is in private schools. Something like a half of urban enrollment is in private schools. The specific private school you go to depends on where you can get in and where you can pay. And so that's where a lot of the concerns around social stratification have been. The policy, the Right to Education Act in 2010, it imposed this 25% quota for students from specific backgrounds. And the one thing, so the details of this have already been spoken about, but the one thing that you really need to think about this is the largest school integration policy that exists anywhere, right? So this is partially implemented, and it affects 4 million kids as of 2019. If it was fully implemented, it would affect 16 million, and that's very large. So it really matters whether we get the details of this right or not, okay? So that's kind of like broad background. We're going to study this in a state called Chhattisgarh. I'll tell you a little bit more about it. It's about 30 million people, so kind of think of it like as Uganda, right? And what we're going to do is do 2 sets of things, or 3 sets of things rather. One, just see whether the policy actually meets its stated objectives of actually expanding educational opportunities for students from particularly disadvantaged backgrounds, right? I mean, that's the first order goal of what the policy is trying to do. And we'd be doing this using lotteries that are embedded in the application system. The second is to really start looking at who's applying to these, right? So what does the incidence of this look like? And actually, that's going to be the core of what I'm going to talk about, which is how do eligible households compare with the population? How do these students who apply compare with the population which was eligible to apply? Because a lot of the story that's going to come in is about selection into applying, even when there isn't any selection in who gets the seats. And the last bit is to look at, why is it that the poorest households don't apply? And what can we really say about constraints and frictions that make a policy that really is intended to be incredibly progressive, that's had a lot of attention at the national level in various states, lots of academic attention, and why is it that it still ends up being a lot less progressive than we would like it to be, okay? So you already know the policy context, but essentially what it does is it says that every private unaided school shall admit at least 25% of the strength of grade 1, which is the incoming class, children belonging to specific groups, and the last sentence is kind of important. Where the school admits children at a pre-primary level, such admissions will be made at that level, right? So if you have a nursery or an LKG section attached to your school, these admissions will happen there, and that's going to be important, right? And it's motivated on the same kind of grounds as school integration policies everywhere. That's Chhattisgarh. It's kind of in the center of the country. It's a mid-sized state in the Indian sense, in both population and size. It's historically a very poor state. So there's been a bunch of development, but educationally, historically, it's been kind of deprived. The seats are allocated through a centralized allocation mechanism. For those of you who love these details, it's an immediate acceptance algorithm. If a school receives more applications than there are seats, these are allocated by lottery. For those of you who work in US education, this is how charter schools work. This is how lots of school assignment mechanisms in lots of settings work. All of Latin America seems to work like this as well, okay? Parents don't pay any top-up fees, or aren't meant to pay any top-up fees, and in Chhattisgarh, they also get grants for uniforms and textbooks to try and bring it at parity with stuff they would have gotten if they had gone to the public sector instead, okay? So, effects on education access. I had to put one slide with the specification, but the basic idea is we're going to compare kids who won a lottery to kids who didn't win a lottery. There's going to be imperfect compliance, which is a bunch of lottery losers are going to get into the seats as well. This is not a bad thing. This is essentially ex post trying to fix many of the things that Srikant was talking about, that there were seats unfilled, parents had just not listed them. So at the local level, officials say, I have free seats there. If you want one there, I can allot it to you. And so that's where this is happening. So we'll use IV to get late. I can talk about the econometrics, but that's not the important bit. And here's kind of the core result, right? So the top bit says, here is the mean of the treated, right? So the lottery winners, and everyone's going to a private school, right? And which is kind of what you'd expect. They wanted to go to a private school, they applied, you gave them a lottery, you gave them a free seat, they went. Okay, so lack of take-up is not an issue. Everything interesting is really happening in the control group, which is, and remember, this y-axis doesn't start at 0, which is that over 3/4 of the people who lost the lottery were also going to a private school. And that figure is a lot higher in grade 1, where, and here the effect on the extensive margin is kind of like 12, 13 percentage points, right? So much smaller. What seems to be happening is that for students who applied in nursery and KG, they were more likely to be in home care. It's moved a bunch of kids from home care into preschool who would have stayed at home otherwise, okay? And that's important because that's not something I think that anyone was really thinking of when putting this policy around, but that's, to a first approximation, really what's happening here on the extensive margin. On the intensive margin, some people are using the policy to upgrade, so they're going to, so they had decided that I will send my kid to a private school, but I might be able to send them to a slightly more expensive private school than I would have afforded without. So they're sending to slightly more expensive private schools, slightly more likely to send them to English medium private schools, slightly more likely to send them to slightly larger schools. But 50% of lottery losers end up sending their kid to exactly the school that they listed as their first preference. And one implication of that is that for a very large share of applicants, this is essentially like a cash transfer. So 67% of public expenditure on a quota seat ends up being completely inframarginal to school choice. Okay, so, and the core of this seems to be that all applicants, right, so the people who are applying are just are from better educated households and richer than the representative population, okay? So a major puzzle there then seems to be that, why are poorer kids not applying? How many minutes do I have?
7.
Oh, where do we see this?
It's there.
Ah, yeah, I was just like, somebody give me a hint, like how much, oh, no, that's fine. I'm doing better than I expected, bah. Okay. In case you think I'm fast, you should hear my co-author Karthik. I am the sedate one in our team, okay? Right, so it turns out that, I mean, if you just, so I can take like 10 seconds for this. But in the representative data, something like 50% of mothers have at least primary education and this is in the population, not just the population of eligible groups. Amongst the applicants, something like 80% do, right? So it turns out that because of selection in who applies, the people who are applying are not just amongst the more privileged within the eligible group, but also amongst the more privileged in the population, okay? And that took us a while to get our heads around. So why is take-up low amongst the poorest? So a lot of what we've been doing over the last 6-8 months has been really trying to figure out the kind of frictions, right? So we can all think of lots of frictions. And, maybe the poorest households just lack the information. There is a policy that doesn't mean that people know that it exists, people know how to apply, people know when to apply, all of those things, right? Maybe it genuinely has something to do with preferences over schools. Maybe these are schools that parents perceive as being less welcoming for their kids, and they really don't want to send them there, right? Maybe these schools are genuinely worse for poor kids. So Natalie Bao has this beautiful paper in Pakistan that shows that the same school has different value added for rich kids and poor kids. And, in a rational world, parents might well know this. Or it could just be the kind of things that Shrikant was talking about, that there's just many barriers to applying. You need to go online, you need to put in various documents and so on, right? So administrative burdens and application complexity. So we did two. So this is something that we can't do with the sample of people who actually applied, right? So this needs to be in the population. So we did a door-to-door listing, or I say we, but Dvitya and Tanisha there, it's the first week that they're out of the field since November, right? So shout out there. And so we did this door-to-door survey in the largest district in both urban and rural areas, and looked at a few different things, trying to quantify this, right? And we made households do like choice experiments where we give them 5 choices which look like the range of options available in the local educational markets, and ask them to rank them from 1 to 5, or to say that, there's no way I would send my kid to the school, under 3 scenarios, right? So there's a status quo, which is that the public schools charge no fees, and the private schools charge posted fees, and all of this is linked to local education market prices. There's a voucher scenario where you say, you know what, there's imagine there's a scholarship that lets you send your kid to any of these schools. So price is not a constraint. How would you rank them then? And something that looks like the RTE, which is we'll make one private school free for you. The others are posted. And what we really wanted to get at was both parents' perceptions on the extensive margin, but also on the intensive margin, right? So because types of private schools matter, so this is kind of the stimulus that they saw. So schools differ in their enrollment, they differ in their prices, they differ in the medium of instruction, in what class does it go on to, and the like, right? And we stayed very much with the kind of characteristics that are easily observed. And we asked them to rank this. We also asked them, you know, how likely did they think their kid would be happy, and so on. Turns out, everyone across the full SES distribution rates private schools well. The difference seems to be that richer parents think teachers will just be worse in government schools. But it's not that demand seems to be low. And I'm not going to go into exactly how we quantify this, but you'll just have to take my word for it or read the paper. But it turns out the take-up of the policy is actually very high across the board, across the SES distribution. There's a bit of a gradient, but it's, you know, the intercept is at 50%. What is important is that at the top end, much of this is going to come out of people who are completely inframarginal, who even in the setting where we aren't offering a voucher, would send their kids to exactly that same school. At the bottom end is where you get extensive margin effects. And some of this is out of information constraints, some of this is out of demand constraints. Not going to go on.
2 minutes.
That's perfect, right? There's bunches more there on the paper. But then, in March, we decided that the only way to figure out how to negotiate the Indian state is to try to negotiate the Indian state, right? So in this subset, in half of these, we said, well, so we had already provided information, and we said, if you're interested in applying, we will send Tanisha with a tablet and an internet-enabled SIM, and she will help you apply. And she will explain to you what you're seeing on the portal, and do you want to apply? The core results on applications and admissions we will only finalize in July, but we learned a lot by doing this, right? Because as Shrikant was talking, like applying online is not trivial if you do not do it every day. Uploading documents is not trivial if you do not do it every day. Putting a GPS pin on your Google map is not trivial if you don't do it every day, right? So we managed to, so I'm not going to actually show you results on the RCT. What I am going to show you is the last bit of what came up earlier when we were talking about administrative burden, which is a bunch of households had already applied by the time we reached them. So they're like, yeah, already sorted. Or that they had done it last year, because in Chhattisgarh you can apply in nursery, in KG, in class 1. But this is the gradient in who has the documents that show that you can apply. This is a poor state. These are poor neighborhoods. Many, many people qualify. But if you're higher on the SES distribution, you're more likely to have the documents that show that you are eligible, right? So even though the policy is designed to be progressive, even though the groups it targets are poorer in the population, the ability to document that you belong to an eligible group is regressive, okay? And that in some senses is where we ning up. This is the last slide, and I have 10 seconds. So the core is that, you know, trying to think about these policies, like application frictions are really central. And we really need to think very hard about this. It's kind of the exact version of a Kramer O-ring theory. You don't get the reward unless every step goes right. So you need to think of solving all frictions. If you solve only one friction, that might be regressive, because that means you nearly made it and we managed to push you up at the margin. And if you relax only some constraints, you know, maybe if you only solve information, if people can't put up their documents, they're not going to get in, right? So there's major trade-offs in how to target, how to bundle, cost effectiveness. That's great. This is a major area along which we're working, also in Tamil Nadu, possibly in other states. There's tons feel free to talk to me if you want to talk about what we're doing on the paper. Feel free to talk to any of our RAs there, because there's 2 who've been trying to solve this in Chhattisgarh, 2 who've been trying to solve this in Tamil Nadu. Okay? And that's it.
Thank you, Abhijeet. So We have exactly 20 minutes for questions, and please, the presenters, can you come in front? Abuja, I am going to start with you. So, given what happened yesterday in the technology, I want to give you priority. So, Abuja, can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Perfect.
All
So,
right, good morning.
please, you have questions, and I will take 2 questions from Abuja initially.
Okay, all right. Good morning. My first question is this. Oh, I'll take the first one, and then someone else will take the second one. All right. I'm wondering why the PPP, that's the public-private partnership, is not really selling well in Nigeria. And, I'm just, thinking and that where from some of the research findings that were shared, it was clear that the government was involved, even in the private sector. But in our case, we are seeing cases where private sectors will go ahead, provide all the tools, provide all the funding and everything, and we are getting less support from the government. So what, maybe it's a suggestion too, therefore, that maybe another research could be done to find out the impact of private schools in Nigeria, so that possibly the result from that could help the government to decide on, forming formidable partnership with the government. Thank you.
Thank you. A second question from Abuja.
My question is to Prachi, the first presenter. In your slide, you mentioned the India Rights to Education Act. It mentioned that students are not expelled. It prohibits physical punishment. So I want to find out, how do Indians discipline their students, particularly those from privileged or economic disadvantaged homes?
I couldn't quite hear. I don't know, Prachi. Were you able to hear the question?
I heard a question around discipline. Is that correct?
I'm trying to find out how students are being disciplined, especially those privileged students from economic disadvantaged homes.
Okay.
My wife is claiming that I am losing my hearing, and clearly that is the case. So let me start with those 2. One about PPP, how it's a more broad one. I don't know, Gul, if you want to take that one, and then the one from Prachi. Gul.
Yeah, okay. Question is about PPP is selling well, but not, in Nigeria, government is not actively involved. I don't know about the Nigeria context, but in Pakistan, we believe government take responsibility of bringing all kids in a school. And they realized, when I interviewed some of the government officials, they said, education is a big portfolio, so government cannot reach entire population. So they need support from private sector. So that's the one reason for PPP. I don't know how Nigeria managed to bring all kids in a school. So why government is not? But personally, I believe the government role should be active, because government can ensure equity. Government can bring better regulations. If private sector is fully being, they operate, they definitely lose equity option. So yeah, equity dimension.
Thank you, Gul. Prachi?
It's, when we speak about India, I think everyone will agree the system is so vast, and the heterogeneity in terms of provision is so vast that it's very hard to say what happens generally. But we can say, in terms of studies that have looked at corporal punishment, there's a study that was done as part of the Oxford Young Lives research program, and showed that in India, actually, corporal punishment was experienced, I think off the top of my head, between 25 to 33% of students had experienced that. I think the paper makes a very clear point and contribution around understanding the lived experiences of the students that access the schools under freeship. And what's very important to understand is that access is as much a normative issue and an experiential one as it is one of policy. Obviously, the question around corporal punishment was big enough for it to be institutionalized in the RTE, in the Right to Education Act, and that it was seen as an explicit provision that no child should be experiencing fear or trauma. This is not something that would be put in lightly. One of the beauties about Indian legislation, they're beautifully phrased. Actually, if you wanted to do just a discourse analysis of legislation, they're beautiful legislation. And this one was very much an idealistic, there are lots of compromises in the way, but there are lots of idealistic norms that were put in there. So it isn't out of the ordinary for students to have experienced corporal punishment. And within different types of schools and different groups of students within those types of schools will have had different experiences in terms of school culture, but also in terms of what is normatively accepted, but there's also a power relationship. So in particular kinds of schools, what kinds of parents would actually take action if children were treated badly, if there was physical or verbal abuse, if there was caste-based abuse, what would actually happen? And so in some ways, it's a question that requires a micro kind of analysis in terms of what would happen in that community. But if we just look at the legislation from a policy perspective, we could see that it would have been a big enough problem for it to be institutionalized in the Act as an explicit provision.
Prachi. Let me take 3 questions in here, and then I will try to go back to Abuja. So let me take questions in this side, and this side. Claire.
So I'm trying to connect Prachi's paper with Abhijeet's paper. And I know you've done loads of econometrics to try and actually compare the attendees in private schools versus those in control schools via your 2-stage least squares. So I buy all of that. But actually what I'm interested in is comparing the private school attendees who came in deterministically versus those that were there stochastically. Because from what Prachi was saying, if you have the label of a free ship, maybe you experience it differently. So I'm wondering if you've actually looked at that. I know it's not as causally identified as what you've reported, but can you tell us something about the experiences in your data, both in terms of outcomes and retention?
That's a very cool question. Someone in the center, Ben.
Yes, my question is also for Abhijeet. Thanks for sharing this today. And you probably had it in the slides and I just didn't catch it. What's the portion of the poor population that is applying? And that's question number 1. And kind of part B is, from your recent study, what you said demand is high. How high amongst the you've been collecting? What portion of the poor are actually asking for the support? Thanks.
Very good. And in this side, yes, Amanda.
So also for Abhijeet's team, one, you mentioned that this policy is serving kids who would have otherwise gone to these schools anyway. Is that the case also for preschool? So are you bringing people into preschool who wouldn't have otherwise gone to preschool? And are these preschools like age appropriate, or are they trying to teach grade 1 curriculum to 4-year-olds? And then my last question is, how much take-up are you getting for the offer of like having someone, maybe you guys can better answer that, but having someone fill out the application for you?
Okay, so I'll take it in reverse order simply because it's most salient. So we're definitely seeing more extensive margin enrollment in the preschool setting. Is this age appropriate or not? The frank answer is we don't know. But these are integrated preschools for a very specific reason, that they're not doing in grade 1 exactly what they were doing in kindergarten and nursery. These are seen as feeder schools in. So the schools very much see it as, no, we need to get you in nursery and go all the way up. By virtue of being managed in that particular way, I think that's actually one of the more interesting dimensions in which the private and the government sectors differ in India, which is that in the private sector, that's just how you get in. You don't typically go into grade 1 necessarily. Whereas in the government sector, you have these daycare centers that are completely disjoint from formal schooling, and they're different ministries, they're frequently different premises and the like. Okay, so I think that was Amanda. On Ben, how high is demand? So one way that we were trying to get at this was to say that, even if we offered to households that imagine there's a scholarship and where would you send the kids? So that ends up being something like 60-ish% in the poorest decile, and it ends up being like 90-ish% in the top decile. So there is an SES gradient, but the intercept is the majority already, right? And then it's actually, it's not completely linear. It kind of increases till the median, and then it's like 90 from the median upwards, right? So at the bottom end, there are some concerns of those kinds. Those don't primarily seem to center on how parents think the experience of their kids would be, which I think links to Claire's point that how different do students look who got in deterministically versus via the lottery. That's something, so we don't have actual outcomes, okay? Because, which is because schools were just closed until very recently. So we think that's potentially important, but given that 50% of the applicants actually ended up just paying for their top choice schools, and we can show that the schools don't really differ in caste composition, they don't really seem to differ in demographics. So my prior, and I want to be very clear, this is only a prior because we actually do want to go and collect data and test this. My prior is that the day-to-day experience of these kids was not going to look very different. What I worry about is because government payments can frequently be delayed in various places, whether that creates pressures around the time that the government hasn't paid, whereas the school knows that you could have paid, you would have applied and come if you hadn't gotten the lottery. I have no idea what those side arrangements look like. But to a first approximation, I don't think that we would come across the kind of US welfare policy style stigma effects, if that's kind of the version we're thinking.
Actually, Prachi is saying that it happened, and that is a very important point, I think, that in the question. I don't know if you know this program in Colombia that is Being a Good Student Pays, in which basically low-income individuals were able to go to any university that they want in the country, as long as they pass a certain threshold in the exam, if they are from low-income families. The experience of the mixing at that level of those populations were so interesting, and basically there were benefits from both sides. And it was kind of in the spirit that Prachi was saying, that the law was, hey, not only the low-income kid benefit from the interaction with the rich kid, but the rich kid benefit. And there is some evidence coming from Colombia from that program that I think it will be super interesting to bear on. So sure.
Can I do like a two-sentence?
Two.
So 2 sentences, literally. I can add many clauses, huh? Okay. So I would actually connect more with something else that Prachi said, which is that because India is so vast and so heterogeneous, it is very, very hard to generalize. I think what she's describing, and what Gautam Rao has a beautiful paper on as well, is true in Delhi, where the differences in where the kids come from in the SES distribution and who the schools cater to is much more vast. And I would think that these things would be completely first order in a very large range of Delhi schools. In Chhattisgarh, it is a poorer population. So these schools and the people who are coming in don't necessarily look that different from students who would have come in anyway, right? So it's not, I guess to a first approximation, I think what we're finding is that for a school integration initiative, it's not really doing tons of integration right now. What it is doing is there is some version of voucher-enabled upgrading, and then there is some element which is like a cash transfer, right? And just trying to disentangle those. And that the potentially very large policy gains from reducing or figuring outside of state ways of unblocking various administrative frictions. Like if we had 6 more months to this year, we would have just told households to get their documentation in order, and then given that seats are undersubscribed, in all states, seats are undersubscribed overall, these guys would be guaranteed admission, right? So there's massive gains about solving frictions, and I think that's where the next wave of this work would have to be.
Very good. Prachi, do you want to add something?
Thank you. I wish I was there. It sounds like such a fun thing to be able to discuss. The reason I wanted to say something is just a few specifications. And I think Abhijeet and both Shrikant would agree. The first thing is, you know, in terms of why I was going on about the idea of multiple collectivities and how they intersect and what that means in terms of RTE provision, is that certain characteristics of individuals are privileged over others in terms of accessing free ships. So for example, Abhijeet, when you say that, you know, it's actually the richer parents who are able to avail of the free ship, yes, there's an issue of class, but the SC status or the scheduled caste status has no income bar. So actually, it might very well be that what they're actually getting is a higher caste distribution. I don't know if you've looked at that, but it could be that you have just more SC applicants because there's no income bar in most states. I don't know if that's the case in Chhattisgarh, but in many states, there's no income bar for SC status. There is one for OBC status. So if you're earning above like 3 lakhs or something and you're OBC, you're a creamy layer, you can't apply. But if you're SC status, that doesn't apply. So there's a question in terms of really understanding how it is that the free ship characteristics that are applicable in every state actually apply in terms of the pool of applicants who can be eligible. And maybe that's why it catches the higher income, because maybe what it's doing, it's actually catching lower caste individuals. The other part of this is free ship schools are not free. Even though the idea is they're meant to be free, they're not. We've done primary data collection with all the 851 households, and I did a previous study. In fact, in the previous study, we found that free ship parents were paying more than non-free ship parents accessing other private schools, because many times those free ship parents might be accessing private schools that they could really not otherwise access, higher fee private schools. There are other ancillary fees. Ancillary fees are actually outlawed by the RTE Act, but the implementation is that in principle, they're still charged. The same thing in terms of Shrikant's paper and Abhijeet's paper talking about documentation. In fact, the initial rules and the model rules and the RTE Act says that you shouldn't be asking for any documentation. Documentation, no bar. So the fact that all of these things now have become major barriers for access shows some issue in terms of, in the end, the gaming characteristics, the social network characteristics, the social capital characteristics, which were supposed to be taken care of under this framework. Then in the end, the implementation is such that they still prevail.
Thank you, Prachi. I am not going to give the floor to another question because we have 2 minutes and it will not do justice to any question. Let me say something as a way of conclusion. I think that, again, these topics are so important because it touches to the way we as a society organize, as the way we organize ourselves. It's clear that one of the ways to think about low quality is about this issue of segregation and how systems are creating segregation in which low-income individuals goes to certain type of schools and high-income individuals goes to another one. So if we try to solve the problem of quality of education, we need to start thinking about how to solve the problem of segregation. In India is very prevalent. In Colombia is very prevalent. In a lot of systems, this is critical. What this paper shows, and I think is very important, is segregation is not only across schools, but in the same school, it can be segregation, and I think this is one of the interesting lines of research. The last point that I want to make is selection can happen in the families or the households. Apparently, the selection happening in the household, information and processes and documents is the key element. So, and that we can solve that one. That side of the equation, we can do policies that can solve. selection of the schools, also we can start thinking about centralized mechanisms in which schools cannot select, but there can be allocation mechanisms that are important and that can be transparent, and they can improve the research of mechanisms that are study proof, and all these things are very advanced, and we can start transpolating those to our context. So thank you so much. It was a very interesting session.